why progress distracted us from the foundations that we needed to have. You know, foundations, as we talked in an earlier episode, is very important. It gives us the strength. It gives us the mounting to mount the structure too. So, you know, as I said in the last episode, we talked about how health often fails. It fails us quietly. How decline usually doesn't announce itself, how the body compensates, adapts, and it just carries on until it just can't. But there's another question that sits underneath all of this, a deeper one. Why are we so good at missing the quiet signs? Why are we good at doing that in the first place? So, you know, the answer is, I believe it has less to do with ignorance and more to do with distraction. Now, distraction, we have it all the time in our lives, and we know about this. It keeps us off of our goals. It keeps us from getting someplace, you know. But, you know, we live in an age of progress. At least that's how we describe it. Faster communication, more technology, more convenience, more information, and progress. And by definition, it's supposed to be a real good thing for us. But progress has a dark side, and we are exposed to that quite often as we indulge ourselves in all these technological advances. Now, progress trains us to look forward always, not downward. It trains us to focus on what's new, not what's holding everything up. It says, keep moving forward, keep progressing. And yet, there's a lot of truth to that. And as I keep evolving and looking into this stuff and studying more, you know, when something works smoothly, we stop noticing it. When electricity flows, we forget the wiring. When water runs good, we forget the pipes are there, you know. And when the body functions well enough, well, we stop asking, what makes that all that possible? Well, until we get a water leak. And then we wonder, where's the water line? Where's it at? It's broke. It's not working. And, you know, modern life, it rewards speed. It rewards reaction. It rewards quick, fast fixes. And what it does not reward is simple patience. And foundations, it requires patience. Now, you know, as we've heard the saying, patience is a virtue. We're trained to believe that newer is always better, that the latest solution must be superior to the old one, that what came before us was just primitive, incomplete, or just naive. But history doesn't actually support that assumption or that formula. Consumerism does, but history does not. Now, you know, in many, many areas of our life, you know, past generations, they ask deeper questions, not because they were smarter, but because they had fewer distractions in life. This is one of the keys that I've learned, and I'm evolving to this. It's what makes me want to go back and look at this. They had more silence, not a lot of noise, more time to sit with uncertainty, more room to think. You know, many times we heard they learned by the light of the coal oil lamp, by reading the Bible. That's how the person learned to read, you know. That's not like that anymore. I didn't come up with this realization through philosophy at first. I came to it through just flat frustration. I noticed that despite all our advances, people seem more exhausted, burnt out, more anxious, more medicated, more disconnected from their own bodies. You know, I've even said, seems like I'm running into zombies, you know. And that may be taking it too far, but there is a disconnection. Now, we know more than ever, and yet we understand ourselves less. That contradiction, it just flat bothered me. Now, as I keep evolving, I keep looking at this, and it made me wonder whether progress had made us efficient, but maybe skipped wisdom. Maybe just not necessarily made us wise, made us dumber. Could it be, So, when we look back, and especially when I'm looking back, researching, wisdom is different from information. Information accumulates. Wisdom integrates, and integration takes time. Now, when progress, it accelerates, reflection and stopping to look in your rear view mirror, so to speak, it slows. And when reflection slows, foundations weaken. Not because we're careless, but because we're just so distracted and we're so busy. Now, this isn't an accusation. This is just me evolving, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing. And you're trying to compose order to all this. It's just observation. Most people aren't trying to live poorly. They're just moving too fast to notice what they're trading away. And all this is distracting. It's a further drift. And I tell you something. What surprised me most was realizing that this tension, it isn't new. It didn't begin with just smartphones. Some people say, oh, it's because we had social media, smartphones. It didn't begin with just the internet. It was already being discussed in the 19th century. And to me, that's amazing. We rewind the tape and go back to trying to get to the basic fundamentals. That's what I'm doing here. And when you still see that noise, it is in the 19th century. Long before modern medicine, long before social media, long before constant connectivity, there were thinkers asking the same fundamental question. What happens to a person when life becomes too fast to live deliberately as you choose? Now, my grandmother used to say, you're moving too fast to let the soul catch up with the body, and these things are all becoming relevant in my life now as I'm trying to research this. Those people, they were watching industrialization reshape society. They were watching cities grow. They were watching convenience replace craft, and they had an uneasy feeling. It just felt like, oh, we're going in maybe in the wrong direction. Maybe something's not right here. And it's not because they hated progress, but because they sensed something essential was being lost. Something quiet, something foundational was being removed. It was kind of like, we're getting off into high weeds here. We're not really sure where this is going to take. It doesn't feel right, So, because before we talk about just individual thinkers as a whole, before we talk about books, before we talk about the ideas, we have to understand the problem. They were responding to a world that was moving faster than the human soul could comfortably adapt to or follow. Now, in the next part of this conversation, I want to sit with those thinkers. And I think it's going to help us to evolve. It's helping me evolve, not as the academics, but as fellow human beings asking how to live well inside this changing world. How do you do it? How do you coexist with all of this change? Now, as we move forward, and we look at why progress distracts us from these foundations. Like I said, when I first began looking backward instead of forward, I wasn't searching for the answers. I was searching for perspective, the view. I wanted to know whether the unease I felt about modern life, and I still feel, was something new, or whether it was simply the latest expression of something, a much older concern. Did this just creep up on us, And that question continues with me, and it led me slowly and almost accidentally into the 19th century. I just kept rewinding the tape. And I'm still evolving into that era. And it's fascinating. The 1800s were not a quiet time. They were a time of acceleration. Industry was expanding. Cities were growing. Machines were replacing handwork. Schedules were tightening. Demands were greater. And to the people living through it all, it just felt like progress. Things is looking up, And in many ways it was, but not everyone was comfortable with the direction it was going. Now, we always want to keep one foot saying, it's great to have these amenities, it's great to have that, and I'm not knocking any of them. I like electricity, I like all of that stuff. But there's other things that we have to be aware of, and so some people just looked at that speed and felt acceleration. Others felt unease, not because they were afraid of change, but because they just sensed something human was being left behind. Now, I tell you, that tension, what I've discovered is I think where thinkers like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson emerged. It's interesting how they all, the group all came together, and they come with that, still, trying to come up with solutions. Now, Thoreau, and I'm evolving, I'm looking, and I'm researching Thoreau. Thoreau is often misunderstood. He's reduced to a caricature, a man who ran off into the woods to escape responsibility, but that, I don't think that's what he was doing at all. Thoreau wasn't rejecting society. He was questioning, I think, whether society had just become too loud to hear oneself think, to get back to the basic fundamentals. I think many of us feel that way too. I think we feel uneasy, and I think we can evolve and we can make something out of this. We can learn from this. So, when we look at Thoreau went to live deliberately. He wasn't pursuing isolation. He was pursuing clarity. Now, I think he wanted to strip life down to its essentials, not to live forever that way, but to understand what actually mattered, and cut the noise out. And I think that's what he was doing. Like my grandmother said, slow down and let the soul catch up with the body, And I feel like more and more that's the sense we're given, and it's still interesting today. Now, that's what makes Walden so enduring. It isn't a how-to manual for escaping civilization. It's a meditation on attention, on refusing to let life become something that merely happens to you. That you're just floating down the stream, and you don't have any control. I tell you what struck me reading Thoreau later in life was how practical his concern really was. He wasn't asking how to live perfectly. He was asking how not to live accidentally. Now, that question feels so much more, even more relevant now. And I think it's so much, I think that we'll find wisdom in this, and I think it'll help us in our modern day living so much. Now, modern life is efficient, but efficiency doesn't guarantee meaning. It doesn't guarantee health, and it doesn't guarantee wisdom. And that's somewhere we don't get when we're distracted. Now, we have to look again. Let's look again. Let's talk about Emerson. Emerson approached the same problem from a different angle. Now, where Thoreau simplified outwardly, Emerson explored inwardly. He was less concerned with where you lived and more concerned with how you thought. Now, these are two people that are they're the thinkers of the 19th century, one of the thinkers, And so, when we look, Emerson believed that most people live in second-hand lives. Bored opinions, bored values, bored ambitions, and the danger of bored living is that it disconnects you from your own experience. It's like today, we get into a copy and paste world, And how much have we seen in our own lives, in modern living, peer pressure? Well, where the sheep go, the sheep will follow, And so, Emerson, it wasn't about the ego or the pride. It was about honesty, truth, about listening closely enough to your own life to recognize what was true for you. And being able to see clear. Many times, people just look and say, oh, they're doing that. I don't want to be an outcast. But is that really true to you? Does it make you happy, Now, this idea becomes uncomfortable in a culture built on comparisons, on metrics, on constant evaluation. When everyone is measuring themselves against everyone else, inner authority, it weakens. And when inner authority weakens, foundations erode. You're not the captain of your own ship. You're just looking to the other being and copy and paste. It's almost like a chain reaction. And what do we evolve in, Now, I'm telling you, this concern, that attention shapes lives. It didn't stop with Emerson and Thoreau. It carried forward into a different line of thinkers. Ones who ask how belief, expectation, and thought patterns influence experience. Now, these are all things that make up the recipe of living. And we're subject to all this stuff. We just got to not drift through life. I think that's what I'm seeing. And I'm trying to apply it in my life. But, as we get back, this is where figures like Emily Cady and Thomas Troward enter the conversation. These are 19th century thinkers too, and I'm just now getting into these, understanding these people. Now, Emily Cady wasn't a mystic in the way people sometimes imagine. She was asking a practical question. And what's interesting about her is how much of suffering is external and how much is shaped by our internal response. How much are we thinking this thing through? How much is this a reflection of our inner thoughts, Now, what makes Cady interesting isn't blind just optimism. It's her insistence that awareness precedes the change, that belief alone doesn't fix a broken system, but that unconscious belief can quietly sabotage one. Now, maybe you're just thinking negative all the time, and you don't realize that, or think lowly of yourself. This is kind of the things that they were talking about. Now, she wasn't denying material reality, and it doesn't appear to me in her writings that she was questioning how much of our experience is filtered through expectation. Now, that idea deserves careful handling, we get into negative thinking and positive thinking. Are we escapist? Are we lying to ourselves? These are interesting things that I think is worth looking at. There's a danger here when mindset thinking is stripped of responsibility. It becomes denial. But when it's paired with discipline and attention and action, it becomes really powerful, I think. And as I keep looking through and examining Cady, I think Cady understood that distinction overall. And I think it's fascinating how these people, where they were examined, they were real thinkers, Now, Judge Troward approached, he was along that same line in that century, and he approached the same terrain with a different temperament. As a legal mind, he was a judge. He was interested in principles and cause and effect thinking and laws that operate whether we acknowledge them or not. It's like a backplane, an operating system. So, it was interesting how he had his take on why these things happen, how this evolves. Now, Troward wasn't teaching wishful thinking. He was exploring the idea that consciousness participates in outcomes not magically but structurally. And he believed that we were the designers of our life, the blueprint makers of that, So what I really appreciated about Troward is his restraint. He didn't argue that thought replaces effort. He argued that thought directs the effort, focuses it. That distinction matters. And very interesting, when you place Thoreau, Emerson, Caddy, and Judge Troward side by side, a pattern, you get a pattern emerges, And now they weren't obsessed with progress. They were concerned with the alignment. And I keep reading this. It's fascinating, but between the alignment between thought and action, now, between values and behavior, between inner life and outer structure. They really believed that if you go into any room, everything was once imagined. The chair, the table, it was all once imagined. So, they sensed that when alignment breaks down, people drift. They become reactive. They live fast but shallow. So, if somebody has a blueprint and they go build a house, if they get distracted, they won't finish that house. And this is kind of what they're saying in life. We're the designers and the blueprint makers and the project managers of our lives to follow the plan. Now, are we drift? Now that same drift shows up today, and it shows up in different forms, in health, in relationships, in work, in the way people chase solutions without understanding the causes. Now, I'm just wanting to point out what I'm seeing as I study about these what these thinkers understood is that foundations are invisible until they fail, whether those foundations are physical, mental, or moral. It's just like we were saying earlier. Oh, we got a water line that busted. Then we're running around trying to figure where the break's at. But before that time, we're contented just to have water flowing and satisfied and thankful about that, or just we take it for granted. Now, once a foundation is compromised, I think everything built on it becomes unstable, and no amount of surface improvement can fix that sort of thing. And there we are again, back to the failed system that gets our attention, But what could we have done up to that point? Now, this is where their ideas stop being historical and start becoming personal, because the question they were asking is the same one we face now. How do you live deliberately in a world that rewards speed over depth? How do we? And what do we get out of that? Do we lose sophistication? Do we lose morals? Well, there's so many things, tragedies to that. Now, in the next part of this conversation, I just want to bring ideas back down to ground level. Not as philosophy, not as theory, but as daily practice. What does a practical person do with this knowledge? How do you live attentively without retreating from life? How do you integrate wisdom without becoming so rigid? And that's where this reflection leads next. Now, how do you blend? How do you not get skewed so much? How do you keep a balance, that's really the key to this is balance. Everything, we need a balance to things. So, as I was saying, when ideas survive more than a century, it's usually not because they were just clever, not trendy. It's because they were honest, The thinkers, the thinkers we've been talking about weren't trying to impress their time. They were trying to understand themselves inside and out. Now this is what gives their work some weight and makes it very interesting for us to, on this journey to find wisdom, find answers to our own problems, to look back and see what was all of this about. Because that century is still influencing us today. So what they were really wrestling with wasn't technology, it was pace. They sensed that when life accelerates beyond a certain point, something essential gets lost, not all at once, but quietly. The danger of speed isn't that it makes life harder, it's that it makes life shallower. That's where the unsophistication comes in, to move quickly, hurry up, fast forward, When everything moves fast, reflection feels inefficient, and when reflection disappears, foundations weaken. We just move through it. Oh, let's get to the point. I just want to, and then we see no need in that reflection. Now, most people don't wake up intending to neglect their health. They don't plan to ignore their inner life. They don't choose to drift consciously. Drift happens because attention is scattered. You're trying to be attentive to so many things that 9 times out of 10 aren't worth your attention. But we don't see it like that. And we always check messages, we check schedules, we check responsibilities, and somewhere along the way we stop checking ourselves. And it's a shame that we lose that. Now, this is where philosophy becomes very practical, not in abstract theories, but in small daily decisions. Where do you pay attention? What do you say yes to? What do you say no to? What do you allow to go unquestioned? What deserves your attention, on a daily basis? Now, responsibility, it doesn't require intensity. It requires consistency. It doesn't demand perfection. It just asks for honesty. And can you go by that stream every day and put one pebble and drop it in there and do it consistently? Or do you get frustrated and just throw the whole bucket of pebbles in, get it over with, Consistency. Living deliberately doesn't mean withdrawing from the world. It means engaging with it consciously, choosing where your energy goes instead of letting it be pulled everywhere at once. Now, we've heard many people say, military, divide and conquer. Well, that works like this too. Distractions, they divide and you get conquered. Something conquers you, And now this applies across the board, but it applies directly to health, not in a dramatic way, but how you relate to your body over time. Do you treat it as something to manage only when it fails, or as something to support quietly every day? It's like the water line breaking, The body is constantly communicating through tension, through fatigue, through sleep. You're getting enough sleep, through recovery. But these signals aren't subtle. They don't demand a lot of attention. They invite it, I remember I had a lot of problems and I just wasn't getting enough sleep. Well, there was a clue right there. And so I tried to work on that. But it took me a long time before I noticed that as being very important. When life is rushed, things slowly get ignored and just quietly ignored long enough that the problems grow large enough to demand greater attention, to get our attention. And, this pattern repeats everywhere. in relationships, in work, in purpose. When feedback is quiet, it's easy to miss. When it's loud, it's already late. Now, what the 19th century thinkers, what they understood is that attention is the real currency of life. Where attention goes, structure follows. Where attention disappears, decay happens. The breakdown, it starts to happen. You can see it. You can see it. Now that applies to thought, to behavior, to health, to meaning. It applies, and you can see the result of that in society. You can see the result of that in people, in our own lives, you know. One of the hardest things in modern life is restraint. Not because restraint is painful, but because everything encourages excess, more information, more stimulation, more urgency. Now, there goes stress. The stress levels are up, and tension, push, and to always produce something, you know. But restraint isn't deprivation. It's alignment. It's choosing enough instead of chasing more. Now, alignment. And that's really what we're talking about here, you know, alignment, strong foundation, your benchmark. You know, Thoreau simplified his environment. Emerson simplified his thinking. Caddy simplified her inner dialogue. Judge Troward simplified cause and effect thinking. Different paths, but the same goal. Now, how interesting that all these people were on the same page like that, you know. We don't need to live in cabins. We don't need to reject modern life, but we do need to resist becoming unconscious. Just drifters, participants in it, you know. Whatever happens, happens, that sort of thing, you know. So it gets back to, we need to be the project managers to our lives. A few honest questions can change everything. What actually improves my life is a good question to start with. If, you know, and that's what I had to do. I had to and I continually ask these things. What quietly drains it? Or what's draining it? What am I doing out of habit rather than in intention? What am I doing? Am I drifting? Am I mindlessly unaware of what's happening? You know, I don't want to fall into that, and I'm constantly working towards getting out of that. Now these questions don't require answers all at once. I'm evolving. I can't answer them all at once, but we need to keep evolving and trying to do better. Now, they work over time. I really believe that. Now, as we age, the margin for unconscious living shrinks. Recovery, it takes longer. Signals, it gets real clear. Excuses wear thin. That's not a loss, it's an invitation. Dignity isn't found in resisting age. It's found in responsible living. It's found in responding to honesty, by adjusting, by supporting the foundations, by paying attention and being aware of things. Don't lie to yourself. If you feel that, you know, be honest. That's the thing. Be honest to yourself. That's the old saying, to thine own self be true. Now, there's a quiet strength in choosing awareness over denial, in choosing care over neglect. You know, just, you can't put things off, but face it right then. Be responsible about it. Now, what I'm studying, I'm talking to myself too. I don't have all this down, but as I evolve, these are main key points. Responsibility it's not a burden. It shouldn't be a burden. It's agency. It's the understanding that while you can't control all outcomes, you can influence the trajectory, and you can do your best to try to control, where you're going. It's that compass effect, Small decisions compound, small neglects compound too. The difference shows up years later, not dramatically, but undeniably they do show up. And, I tell you, this is why foundations matter more than progress. Progress changes the surface. Foundations determine whether the structure lasts. Now, this is very key. Foundations determine whether the structure lasts. You see it in buildings, you can see it in everything. Got to have a good foundation. Now, these thinkers we've discussed weren't trying to escape their time. They were trying to inhabit it fully. And to live awake, they wanted to live deliberately, to live in alignment with reality rather than in illusion, And they had time to think about these things, but still they felt the burden coming of the distractions, of the noise of life. Now that's the posture I'm trying to adopt here in my own life, not as an expert, not as a teacher, but as a practical person just trying to live better. And I don't want to go out with just as a drifter, just taking one. I want to go out the best that I can and try to understand things the best I can. Paying attention, supporting foundations, moving a little slower, thinking a little deeper. These are, I think, what I'm learning are the keys to this thing, Progress, I don't think, is the enemy. But progress without reflection, it's dangerous. When speed replaces wisdom, life becomes efficient but not very meaningful. It becomes empty. This conversation is just an invitation to slow down just enough to notice what matters in life. And I think these are important. You've heard the saying, smell the flowers along the way, All these things, and when I was younger, I heard all this stuff, and it starts to make sense, Now, I'm going to tell you something. And now, as we look in the next episode, I want to continue this topic to explore how aging, meaning, and responsibility converge later in life, and why some voices from history speak more clearly to us than when we get older. Until then, take care, and thank you for sitting with me in this vlog. This vlog is ended. Thanks.